Hello, everybody. My name is Angelos Chaniotis, and I'm a professor of ancient history and classics at the Institute for Advanced Study. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker in today's event that is jointly organized by the Institute for Advanced Study and Gorgias Press. And it is also a great pleasure to introduce the speaker, whom I know academically, although we have never met, and although we have all briefly overlapped in Oxford, in colleges that were opposite each other, but somehow we never managed to meet there. Michael Jackson Bonner is from Canada. He is currently working as a political advisor, but he has done something that actually is extremely useful and should be a model in international politics. That is to use as a political advisor someone who knows history. This is unfortunately not very common. He read classics and Near and Middle Eastern civilization in his undergraduate studies and in his master and doctorate studies. He did his doctorate in Sasanian history, which is a rather, and unjustly so, not a very well studied subject in the area of ancient history. At the Institute for Advanced Study, we did have Marek Olbricht a few years back, who is also a specialist in Sasanian history. And he finished his PhD in Oxford, and he has been working as a political advisor ever since, combining his knowledge of the history of the Near East or Middle East. Actually, the Sasanian Empire expanded in various historical periods. It's one of the ancient empires that can offer a lot of very interesting paradigms in terms of organization, importance of military history for international relations, its relations with other cultures. It was an empire that played a major part in and not only in Asia, but also through its relations with the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, also for the history of the West. And of course, it is an empire that is situated in an area of paramount importance for the understanding of military tension, but also cultural tensions and religious tensions. And I very much look forward to today's talk, as I am sure that everybody does. Without any further ado, I just express again my great joy of finally meeting him in a sense, as a virtual person in Zoom. And with this welcoming words, I just give him the floor. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm honored to be here. It's great to meet you as well. And as I say, it's an honor to be able to discuss my book. I'm, of course, very sad that the book came out right at the beginning of the pandemic, so there was never a book launch. So every time I get to talk about it, sort of pretend that it's the book launch. So I'll do that again today. I've made a presentation here. I'll share my screen. So I don't want to get too deep into the matter of Sasanian history and get sort of bogged down in details. I want to give you an overview of the topic, an overview of the book, and a little explanation as to why I wrote it. I'll start with why I wrote it. I wanted, when I started cultivating an interest in Sasanian Iran, I wanted to read a narrative history of it. And there aren't really many. There's one in English from the late 19th century by Rawlinson, which is long out of date. You can still read it for pleasure. It sounds nice, has wonderful style and everything, but it's incomplete. There's also the famous book L'Iran sous les Sassanides by Arthur Christensen, which is somewhat more somewhat more advanced, although it comes from the 1930s, and we know a lot more now, and it's a bit light on what I would call political history, and a little bit heavy on the more sort of cultural aspects, like the splendor of the Sasanian court and so forth, which takes up a lot of space there. So I want to do something more in the way of a narrative that focuses on political history using all of the sources that are available. So there are five main themes and then lessons that I want to talk about today. These are I guess if you want to boil down what the book is about, this is what it's about. The origins of the Sasanian state, its nature, and its place in the sort of bigger history, and then there's a little bit of historiography scattered within it. So we'll discuss those before getting to what I call the lessons of Sasanian history. The origin of the Sasanian state is, let's say, mysterious. It's clouded in what looks like mythology, myth-making on the part of the dynasty itself. There's a wonderful Middle Persian text called the Karnamege Ardashir Pabegon, which is, probably domestic propaganda that explains, who Ardashir was and where he came from and who Sasan was and so forth. I think it's worth taking note of that. It's interesting and so forth. But I don't think that we're ever really going to know very much about who Sasan was, and how Ardashir is related to him and so forth. So I focus on the political and cultural context that would have facilitated the rise of Ardashir, who at the time in the 3rd century AD was the governor of the province of Fars within the so-called Parthian Empire. To cut a long story short, I would say that although the Parthian state had been sort of fissiparous, it was subject to revolts and to dynastic and aristocratic tensions many times in the past, and there had been a history of civil war and so forth. That it was the governor of Fars who would have been best placed to found a dynasty, because that was the heartland of the old Achaemenid monarchy, the monarchy founded by Cyrus. You can see here there's the tomb of Cyrus here and the ruins of the Achaemenid palace. These were in Fars. They were the possessions of the governor of Fars, not directly of the Parthian monarch. So there was a sort of prestige that the governor of Fars had that the Parthian monarch didn't have. And I think there would have been a natural progression of thought to think that, however dimly remembered the Achaemenid state might have been, and it probably was dimly remembered, that the evidence of a great empire was there. And of course, there is a record within the Hebrew Bible of at least some of the doings and sayings of the Achaemenid kings. The Jewish population within Iran had always been a significant minority, and there would have been, I think, enough cultural memory of the Achaemenids to suggest that this idea of a great international empire could have been revived. And I think that Ardashir sort of thrived on that. The new state was called what I translate as the Empire of Iran, in Middle Persian, Iran Shahr, or in modern Persian, Iran Shahr. This is, as far as anybody knows, this phrase had not been attested before, that it was the Sasanian state that first used it. I think that it's possible to see in it an allusion to the phrase that you find in Zoroastrian scripture, the Aryanem Vayeja. I think it literally means something like the expanse of the Aryans, or the abode of the Aryans, which is probably not a real place, but a religious concept of the ancient homeland of Zoroastrianism. And I think that you can probably argue that there's a sort of blending of the idea of this old sedentary empire with the religious conception of the Zoroastrian homeland that I think Ardashir combined. And this idea, this idea is obviously connected with the idea of a state religion, or at least a religion particularly favored by the reigning dynasty, and this gave the Iranian Empire sort of great tensile strength. And of course, obviously, long before the Roman Empire was Christian. So that's theme number one. Theme number two, the nature of the Sasanian state. This has been discussed a few times in the past. Older scholars like Jakob Burckhardt set the tone. His view was that the Sasanian state was very badly organized. It was kind of like a feudal kingdom. It was a collection of sort of inconsistent principalities and different sort of local political orders, where the rule of the main king didn't fully penetrate, that real power was exercised by local kings and magnates and aristocrats and so forth. He even goes as far as to say that the empire was poor, it was underpopulated, it didn't have a standing army and so forth. This was taken up again later by Altheim and Stiel, and they argued in the 50s that the Sasanian state was kind of feudal, it was sort of a quasi-feudal state, and this idea is still at the root, I believe, of the more recent arguments of Parvaneh Pourshariati, to the effect that you have a sort of Sasanian family resting on top of this sort of coalition of aristocrats who are exercising real power. I have a very different idea. I think that there is evidence for a strong central government, a strong ideology of state, a big element of which was the Zoroastrian religion, an organized system of dynastic power, which was never really replaced, despite one notable attempt to do so, as well as a strong nobility. Early modern European states, I think, point to the example of military and foreign policy roles were filled by aristocrats without undermining the role of a central monarchy. So, what is the evidence for this? Well, the first piece of evidence to look at is the Sasanian monetary system. The Sasanian coins suggests that the empire was a single economic unit, a single fiscal unit, and the Sasanian coinage was notably always struck at a very high standard. The purity of the silver drams didn't really waver very much throughout the life of the dynasty. You also have the evidence of agricultural and irrigation infrastructure. I've got this nice picture there of the dried up Nahravan Canal, which is sort of branching off from the Tigris River. This picture, incidentally, was taken by Gertrude Bell, which I found on Wikimedia, or whatever they call it. This is a gigantic infrastructure project, which is exactly the sort of thing that you would associate with a strong centralized state. It doesn't look like the sort of thing that you would find from, sort of local. I can't imagine that local aristocrats would have had the wherewithal, the resources to do this sort of thing. And of course, there's also Sasanian defensive infrastructure, made famous most recently by the wall across the plain of Gorgan from the Caspian Sea eastward into the mountains. This was the second largest wall in Eurasia after the Chinese walls. This is, I think, incontrovertible evidence of a potent centralized government capable of planning such a project, raising the money for it, funding it, staffing it, defending it with men and horses and logistics and all the rest of it. And of course, there are also the evidence of defensive works in the Caucasus, which plugged gaps in the natural defenses there, which we could also point to. So yeah, before we leave that, potent centralized state, strong ideology of government, and the sort of strong sense of a Sasanian dynasty that really impressed itself on the empire. Third theme, I'm a big fan of big history, as they call it. I did not want to write simply an account of warfare with Rome, even though that was obviously a big part of Sasanian history. And of course, we have to depend a great deal on Greco-Roman classicizing historians. But I think that our dependence on those sources can persuade us to overstate the importance of Roman power in the West. I believe, though, that those two states, those two empires, were equally matched. The old idea that somehow Rome only won when it did win because of Sasanian, that Rome only lost when it lost because of Roman errors. I don't think that's true. I think that the two powers were equally matched. But a far greater threat came to the Sasanian state from the world of the steppe, from the nomadic powers, which of course also threatened Rome. The way into these sources, though, is somewhat difficult for most of us. I had to depend on Chinese sources in translation, which are not easy to find, but they are very informative. Here we have a picture of Herodotus and the Chinese historian Sima Qian. They both, they come from slightly different times, but they both produce remarkably similar portraits of the peoples of Inner Asia, with obvious stress on their capacity for warfare, which sedentary powers struggled to meet. And of course, both, as I argue, both Iran and China, and to a lesser extent Rome, adopted similar policies in dealing with the peoples of Inner Asia. Often, it was often hopeless to fight them, so they would often be taken into federated with the local forces, brought in to defend the frontier against other nomads. And of course, it was China who first did this, but the same strategy worked equally well for Iran. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I would like to point out that I think that the focus on the bigger picture of Eurasian history, and specifically on the nomads, helps to explain some things within Sasanian history that seem otherwise inexplicable or sort of odd. One noteworthy thing is that the huge war that Shapur II started with Rome, the one in which Julian the Apostate died, that was suddenly broken off in the 350s because of the sudden appearance of the Huns in eastern Iran. I go some length to try to explain why that happened and why they appeared and who these people were. The the sort of classicizing word for the people that I call the Huns appears in the history of Ammianus Marcellinus. He calls them the Chionitai, Chionites. which sounds like a kind of Iranian corruption of the word for Hun, which I'm getting into sort of controversial territory here, but the Chinese called them Xiongnu, and I believe that there's a sufficient evidence following more recent studies on this to link these people up, not in the sense that they were all sort of one homogeneous group of people, but the people that we call Huns represent a kind of political confederacy, that we might think of the word Hun more as a political name rather than an ethnic one. Anyway, the threat that the Huns posed to both Iran and Rome eventually became so great in the 5th century that it was this mutual threat that led to a sort of cessation of hostilities for most of that century, and also to the toleration of Christianity within Iran. It was more beneficial to remove whatever might be conducive to tension between the two powers than it would have been to continue prosecuting warfare. So this led to you could think of the movement of the Huns as sort of a catalyst for the development of Persian Christianity throughout the 5th century and beyond, if you really wanted to. And of course, there's this ancient tradition within Zoroastrian scripture viewing the steppe as this sort of frightening place, this abode of demons and sorcerers and a place from which danger comes, which obviously has precedent going back a long way. It's arguable that the conflicts between Iran and Turan in the Shahnameh represent earlier nomadic migrations and their effect on Iran, and possibly you can possibly associate those things with the fall of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in the east as well. So the Huns, I don't want to dwell too much on the Huns. The Huns were eventually replaced by others, and it was the rise of the Turks, the distant ancestors of those who now live in Turkey, that posed by far the greatest threat, both to Iran and Rome. And you can also argue, as I try to do in the book, that it was the nomadic world that really shaped the conquests of Khusro II in the early 7th century, and the sort of shaped the huge war between Rome and Iran. I'll just give you a few examples. That Khusro waited until the Turks were sort of quiescent, when there was a sort of dynastic struggle had broken out in the steppe, before beginning the war. And this presupposes intelligence gathering and keeping an eye on the steppe and so forth. But of course, it wasn't to last, because the Roman Emperor Heraclius formed an alliance with the Turks to help put pressure on the Sasanian State and to invade through the Caucasus in the late 620s, that eventually put an end to Khusro II's reign and life. So again, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but the point is that you have to look at the steppe and the nomadic powers in order to get a full picture of Sasanian history. And I tried as hard as I could to bring that out in the book. Okay, historiographical questions. Obviously, I didn't want a narrative history to get too bogged down in source criticism and things like that, but you have to touch on it from time to time in order to explain which sources to trust and so forth, especially if they don't agree. In my previous work, in my master's and my doctorate, I suggested that that there was no indigenous tradition of historiography within Sasanian Iran. I no longer believe that. I've changed my mind. I think that there was such a tradition, but it isn't. It wasn't reflected in Middle Persian. We don't have any Middle Persian examples of it. We do have examples of Iranian historiography, or historiography from an Iranian perspective, that come to us in Syriac and Armenian. And this may sound strange, but it's no less Iranian for being Armenian or Syriac, or at least the Iranian outlook or worldview is no less to the fore for not being written in Middle Persian. They just don't, like the sources that I'm referring to, Moses Kornatzi or Sebeos, Pseudo-Joshua the Stylite, John of Ephesus, they don't represent necessarily the view of the Sasanian court or the Sasanian government, but they certainly are aware of and transmit something close to an Iranian view of things, which is a corrective to the Roman sources that we have to depend on. Even in the case of Pseudo-Joshua the Stylite, who isn't particularly fond of the Iranian government, or a lot of Armenian historians are not really they're not really in favor of the Sasanian dynasty, but they're obviously aware of all sorts of elements of the administrative state or policy and so forth that Roman sources just don't capture at all. So I rank these sources very high in the quest to try to get at some indigenous Sasanian view of the world. I think these are invaluable, far more important than sources like Ammianus or Procopius, Agathias, who really don't make much of an effort to understand the Iranian world at all, and the little sort of excursuses that they throw in about the organization of the Sasanian State is sort of all recycled Hellenistic tropes or imaginative exaggerations of things that you find in Herodotus and so forth. So this, I believe, these sources, these Armenian and Syriac sources, are the way in, and they should always have pride of place. There is, of course, this other tradition that is very hard to get around, the so-called Khodai Namag tradition. I call it the royal tradition, because, of course, this name, Khodai Namag, the Book of Lords, this name is nowhere attested in the Sasanian era. So, it's sort of giving a putative book an imaginary name. It's easy to pile up this sort of long chain of imagination that ultimately doesn't really amount to anything. But when we look at works like Dinuari or the history of Tabari and the Shahnameh and so forth, there is some kind of tradition that they're transmitting. That's, I think, quite clear. And we should not ignore it. And I didn't ignore it either. However, the idea that you can trace all these things back to a putative royal chronicle, which is what Theodor Nöldeke thought, and it seems like a very convincing idea. It seems superficially very plausible. I don't think it's really true. There is something there, but I'm not really sure what it is. And of course, the texts don't all agree. Even Ferdowsi in the Shahnameh, he seems to be combining a variety of different documents and traditions, and there's some, he refers to some oral, or at least seems to refer to some oral traditions about the Sasanian period. So I think that a unitary royal tradition is very doubtful. It is dangerous, though, to write a history of the Sasanian world depending only on these sources. And I don't think that they should be trusted unless you can corroborate them from outside, which is often possible. Often the Armenian and Syriac sources provide corroboration, and sometimes sources like Procopius and Agathias do agree with things that we find in the later sources. In that case, I think we found the truth. When they cannot be corroborated, I think we have to exercise a great deal of skepticism, but still there are some things you find there and only there that seem to be at least plausible. So I've tried to indicate clearly where those situation where I view something as simply plausible in that tradition. Okay, what are the lessons from Sasanian history? Well, I think that first of all Iranian history, like Chinese history, for example, is a sort of interesting proof that all government, all institutions, culture, they're all very fragile, and they can seem to disappear quite suddenly. But at the same time, they also have this way of coming back. And the idea that Ardashir was this sort of reviver of religion that had been sort of dormant or had somehow fallen apart, or the revival of a vision of a unitary sedentary empire, I think shows that even after a long interval, these institutions and so forth can, in a sense, come back. And of course, the Sasanian Empire fell, but it was Sasanian culture that was an enormous impetus for what we call the golden age of Islam. It was the lives of the Sasanian kings and so forth were of enormous inspiration to the Abbasid statecraft and courtly manners and architecture and all the rest of it. And even to this day, the concept of an Iranian state, I think, owes a great deal to the Sasanian world, and even the Safavids revived that concept of Iran Shah, the empire of Iran, even long after long after Zoroastrianism would have been widely believed in. So I think we see proof that however rough and bad things seem now, that they can get better and recover. And before I end, I will end with an explanation of the title of the book, because lots of people, I've been on podcasts and lots of people ask about the title of the book, and they say things like, well, don't you know that there were empires of Iran after? Why do you say this one was the last one? Okay, well, I know that there were other empires, but there's a sense in which the Sasanian state, first of all, the Sasanian state was the last empire before the coming of Islam. But there was also this sense in which it was the fullest and completest development of this imperial vision, or this sort of vision of a civilized state, and subsequent Iranian states always looked back to that one as the last time it had been done, the last and best time it had been done. It was sort of future inspiration. Okay, that's all.
Thank you so much, Michael. And now we can open the floor, the virtual floor, to questions. And you can type your questions in the chat box and read them. While we wait for that, I have an art history question, if you don't mind. Sometimes when you look at Iranian or Sasanian art, like the coins that you just showed, they very much resemble ancient Mesopotamian art. And I was wondering what the connections are. And if, you know, any borrowings or any contact there. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great question. And I'm unfortunately not as knowledgeable as I should be about art history, but I think that the general principle that kind of an old-fashioned view, but this sort of succession of Near Eastern empires that sort of all imitate one another, I don't think it ever really stopped. And that, you know, when Cyrus entered Babylon, it was more this sense that he was reviving an older idea of Mesopotamian monarchy and empire rather than terminating it. And that even before that, the Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian states were looking far back into the past and reviving artistic forms and even linguistic forms that were long in abeyance. And even that the use of the title King of Kings, that's the old Assyrian royal title, right, which carried on, you know, even into the 20th century. The last Pahlavi monarch, you know, was the last one to have it. The title is, you know, thousands of years old. And I think that the imitation of artistic motifs and architectural forms, I think, is part of that same tradition. And you know, even the use of Aramaic to write Pahlavi, same thing. You know, that's what the prestigious that was the prestigious thing to do for a Mesopotamian monarchy. You do what the last one did, and it has sort of ancient antecedents which you know, carried on for quite some time. There's, you know, even Abbasid architecture or Abbasid art, they would have inherited it all from the Sasanian world, but I think at the root of it are things that are far, far older.
Yeah, I think Angelos, you have a comment. Do you wanna?
Okay, I have already sent it as a chat, but I can say it also in person. I very much enjoyed your talk. I especially liked your discussion of the sources and the problems that we have in understanding the Sasanian Empire, given the limitations and sometimes contradictions of the sources. And of course, a lot of the sources come from the enemies of the Sasanian Empire. And I can talk of personal experience. Being Greek and having been educated in a Greek school, I had to celebrate every year on the 14th of September, the day of the erection of the Holy Cross, which is actually a historical anniversary, the anniversary of the recovery of the cross by Heraclius after a campaign against Chosroes. So for the Greeks, the Sasanians are just one of the sequence of enemies representing the bad East that always tries to invade and destroy civilization in the West. The victory of Heraclius is just one in a sequence of victories after the sea battle of Salamis and after the conquest of Alexander the Great. And my question is, because you mentioned Jacob Burckhardt, for whom these religious things were not that important, although he recognized the importance, of course, of religion in other respects. Is religion a part that influenced the way the Sasanian Empire was perceived in the West, and has it influenced the neglect in the study of the Sasanian Empire, treated as you clearly presented at the beginning as an empire that was actually did not have a very sound foundation. And by contrast, I would like to return to something that you mentioned towards the end, whether the Sasanian Empire played a part in the political propaganda of the Iranian monarchy in the 20th century. For instance, the last Shah celebrated the 2,500 years from the, I don't remember whether it was the death of Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire or whatever, if the Sasanian Empire played a similar part as the Achaemenid Empire in modern Iran. Thank you.
Okay, great questions. First of all, this idea of the conflict between East and West, and this idea of like stealing the cross from the Holy Sepulchre and then having the Roman Emperor return it, it's really quite disingenuous, because the people who got it back and who threatened to destroy Iran unless it were returned were the Turks, and there's this menacing letter that is preserved in the Armenian history of Moses Daskoransi, where the Turkish Khagan threatens just total destruction of Iran unless he returns the wood of the cross, right? So, you know, obviously there was an alliance with the Romans, but I mean, the Romans hardly did anything. It was, and if it were not for the military power of the Turks, you know, nothing would have happened. Like we would all be, you know, we would all be Zoroastrians now, or you know, or at least Persian Christians now, right? So I've always thought that kind of framework was really silly, but it is the view that Heraclius and company would have wanted you to have. All of the Roman propaganda that comes out of that period is about how the Persian king is, you know, is extraordinarily evil, that his defeat consigns him to hell. He's compared to a dragon, you know, that appears in the Apocalypse, which also would have had Zoroastrian significance. And you know, it was the Roman state that framed this conflict as a religious one, and that's still how it is remembered by many people, and it is commemorated in the church. But when the church commemorates the victory of Heraclius, they should be commemorating the victory of the Turkish Khagan, Tong, and Sipi, or I think that was his name. I can't remember what his name is exactly. But there was another part to your question I'm looking at.
The modern Iran and how it treated, until the the Islamic Revolution, how it treated the Sasanian Empire. Was it similar to the Achaemenid Empire? Looking at they looked at the Achaemenid Empire as the foundation of the Iranian monarchy. Was the Sasanian Empire part of the continuity, so to say, that leads ultimately to Reza Pahlavi?
I think that you know, there's an enormous emphasis on Cyrus because of the fact that, first of all, he was first, and second, because of that cylinder, the Cyrus cylinder, which is always misconstrued as the, you know, founding document of human rights, which it isn't really, but it's you know, it's remarkable for its own in its own right, without exaggerating its significance. But you know, I've never heard anyone, people talk about Cyrus. I've never heard them talk so much about you know, Cambyses or, you know, Darius III. But I think that the vision, the Pahlavi vision of a renewed Iran was fundamentally Sasanian. I think that you know, the idea of you know, a sort of the idea of the new civilization. I think he wrote a book. The Shah wrote a book called like Towards the Great Civilization or something. I think it's basically harking back to the Sasanian Golden Age, not so much to the Achaemenid one. And it's that idea of the Iranian nation that comes out of the vision of Iran Shahr, which is not an Achaemenid idea. It is not a Parthian idea, as far as we know. Even the idea that this word Iran, calling that region of the world Iran, is not really attested. If I remember my Nioli, it's not attested until the Sasanian era. So I think that it's ultimately a sort of Sasanian style revival, and of course that's the one that was most imitated by later Islam. So it sort of makes sense that it would be easier to assimilate it to more recent Iranian culture. But of course, it all started with Cyrus, as they will tell you.
Very good, thank you so much. We have a sequence of questions, or a bunch of questions. The first from Jane Hathaway. What do you think of the recent 2017 book, Reorienting the Sasanians?
Well, I thought it was great. I reference it a lot. I disagree. I know the author, Khodadad, and we met in England. We disagree over the identification of the Huns and the Xiongnu. But I thought it was great. I mean, the general principle that we should turn our view away, a lot of the time from the Iranian Western frontier to the east, where a lot more of the action was, I think is very persuasive. The history of late antique, we would be seriously misunderstanding late antique Iranian history if we focused so narrowly on warfare with Rome or only exchanges of other sorts with Rome, and then suddenly the Arabs arrive. I think that's a completely too narrow view of the Sasanian world, and putting focus more on the East, I think makes a great deal of sense. And I try to follow the example in my book.
Here's a question from Yasmin Amin. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. You mentioned that the Sassanid era influenced the Islamic way to rule in terms of administration and so on. Do you think that the fiqh was also influenced by certain Zoroastrian religious regulations and rules?
I just don't know. I don't know enough to say about either Islamic jurisprudence or its Zoroastrian equivalent. But we could approach the question in a different way. Perhaps there is something that is at the root of all Near Eastern legal traditions, both the Iranian one and the Roman one, that it has something more to do with, say, the legal traditions of the school of Beirut or something like that. Perhaps there's a common origin to all of them, rather than a direct line of influence. If you see what I mean. One of the reasons why I think that is that I don't think that it's merely a coincidence that the reforms of Justinian and those of Khosrow I occurred at basically the same time. Late antiquity was a time for codifying things to begin with, but it seems not to have been simply the view that it was sort of the Romans started it and then the Persians copied it and then the Muslims copied it from the Persians. I'm not sure if I would be inclined to believe that. I think that I would guess that there's a sort of common tradition sort of rolling underneath all of it.
There's a question from Eva Schmallenberger. Thank you for the great talk. Just a quick comment. We can also see a lot of inspiration from the steppe in Sasanian art, for example, in silk textiles. So your point about the influence of this region on Sasanian Iran is really interesting. So I guess it's a comment. And then there's a question from Celia Borgoffen. I was fascinated by your discussion of links with the steppe. How did relations between the Sasanians and the people of the steppe impact trade along the Silk Road? What do we know of diplomatic relations between the Sasanian kings and the steppe chieftains?
Well, the most important, I think the most important example of this is the use of the use that the nomadic powers made of Sogdian merchants, and the reverse. One way of looking at it is that the Hephthalites and Hephthalite Huns and Turks used Sogdian merchants to do their business. Another way of looking at it is that the Sogdian merchants used the nomads to carry out their foreign policy. And it's a sort of symbiotic relationship. And of course, you have Sogdian trading links that from China to Persia and Rome, probably India too, which are sort of in place no matter who the dominant nomadic power was. And there's an interesting historical notice that comes from it's a lost source, Theophanies of Byzantium, which was summarized by the Patriarch Photius. And it's just a very curious stray notice. He says that when the Turks overthrew the Hephthalites, I may get this wrong. It was in the context of the Hephthalite Turkic contest, but that he talks about the silk trading stations that the Sogdians maintained that then get taken out of Persian control, which presumably means that they can no longer tax them or something like that, and then get taken over by the Hephthalites, and then later on the Turks. So for at least economic reasons, Iran would have paid close attention to whoever was in charge of the steppe at a given time. But then there's also the famous example of as the Turks are fighting one another and gradually sort of increasing their power in the steppe, the rival Chinese dynasties are paying them millions of rolls of silk to curry favor with one or the other. And this amounts to just an astonishing amount of silk that then the Sogdian merchants decide they're going to direct as a sort of economic weapon at Iran, and get the Turks to flood Iran with all sorts of cheap silk. And of course, you can see at the same time in Roman sources, Justinian, it's at this moment Justinian is nationalizing the silk industry. And then there's that famous, probably false, probably made up anecdote of the guys who went to China and smuggled the silkworms out. Who knows whether that's real? I don't know how they would have survived. And I also don't know how Justinian would have built up his own silk industry so quickly. But there's obviously something going on, and we only have sort of pieces of it where you have powers in the steppe with their sedentary friends in Sogdiana who are managing this huge network of trade between China, trade mostly out of China. And there's a moment where the state of affairs becomes so desperate in Iran because of all this cheap silk that the king, Khusro I, as I recall, buys all the silk on offer from the Sogdian merchant and then publicly burns it because of the economic danger that it posed to Persian silk traders who were getting their silk out of India and then selling it to Roman merchants at a premium. And this state of affairs eventually turned into a war at the end of the 6th century. you have to read my book. I can't even remember all the details myself, but the Sogdian traders and the Turks are clearly working together with Chinese commodities, mostly silk, to provoke a war between Rome and Persia. And exactly why, maybe to keep trade routes going. I don't know. This is one of the things I attempt to answer in the book.
Very good. Thank you so much, Michael. So that takes us to the end of the QA session, and then I will hand it over to Gemma. Well, before I hand it over to Gemma, I want to thank everybody on the panel, and then thank all the people who attended, and of course, Michael, thank you, our speaker. Gemma?
Thank you. Yes, thank you to Michael for a wonderful talk, and thanks to the IAS, to everyone who's helped with the panel. I'll just add it to the chat, the information, 2 pieces of important information. One is the Zoom link for our next lecture, our final lecture of the year, which is with Laura Hassan, who also has Oxford links. But also, very importantly, if you scroll down, you will see the coupon code to get 30% off Michael's book. I'll put that back in the chat in a new one there. So just Author's Voice 21 in capital letters if you'd like to get the discount on Michael's book. But all the information is there. We would love to see you at the next session with Laura Hassan. Her book has been extremely popular. So I hope that some of you can make it. And we look forward to bringing you the program for 2022. So thanks again, thanks to our speaker, and thanks to our hosts, and thanks to you all for coming and for your excellent questions. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much.
Everyone.